October 1941. Wright Field, Ohio. The sleek silver fighter sat motionless on the tarmac, its distinctive radiator scoop gleaming in the autumn sun. For weeks, the experimental aircraft designated XP-51 had remained largely untouched, accumulating dust while America's top military aviators focused their attention elsewhere. When British liaison officer John Chilton visited the base that month, he discovered something that defied comprehension. The logbook showed exactly 1 hour of flight time since delivery. 1 hour. The most revolutionary fighter aircraft ever designed was being systematically ignored by the very Air Force that would eventually depend on it for victory. The indifference wasn't accidental. America's military establishment had already committed to their chosen champions. The twin-engine P-38, Lightning with its distinctive twin booms promised high-altitude supremacy. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, massive and powerful, would serve as the armored knight of the skies. Most importantly, General Motors was developing the P-75 Eagle, a purpose-built long-range escort fighter that would solve all strategic bombing problems. With such an impressive lineup already in development, why waste time on an untested design from North American aviation? The XP-51 represented everything military planners distrusted about rushed wartime development. Built in just 117 days to fulfill a British Purchasing Commission requirement, the aircraft seemed hastily conceived and poorly understood. Its manufacturer had never built a fighter plane. Its design team lacked combat experience. Most damning of all, early test flights revealed the same fundamental limitation that plagued every American fighter of 1941. Above 15,000 feet, performance degraded dramatically due to the Allison V1710 engine's single-stage supercharger. At the altitudes where German fighters excelled, the XP-51 became just another mediocre interceptor. Military pilots who did encounter the early Mustang expressed skepticism that bordered on contempt. The aircraft's appearance alone violated every principle of American fighter design philosophy. Where the P-47 projected power through massive bulk and the P-38 demonstrated innovation through radical configuration, the P-51 looked almost European in its sleek proportions. Veteran test pilots accustomed to the brutal authority of radial engines questioned whether this delicate-looking machine could survive combat against battle-tested German aircraft. The armament configuration reinforced doubts about the design's combat effectiveness. Early P-51B models mounted their machine guns in the wings, far from the pilot's sight picture and prone to jamming during high-G maneuvers. Pilots discovered during training flights that the weapons installation appeared to have never been properly tested. Guns that worked perfectly during ground testing failed consistently during aerial combat maneuvers. When one frustrated pilot complained about the malfunctioning armament, his instructor's response captured the military's casual dismissal of the aircraft's problems. If you had paid attention in gunnery school, Lieutenant, you would only need one gun to shoot down an enemy aircraft. Even more concerning than mechanical problems was the aircraft's dangerous resemblance to German fighters. The P-51's streamlined fuselage and inline engine created a silhouette that American gunners consistently mistook for the Messerschmitt Bf-109. During early combat deployments, friendly fire incidents occurred with alarming frequency. Bomber crews trained to shoot at anything resembling German fighters engaged their own escorts repeatedly. B-17 turret gunners, unable to distinguish between friend and foe at combat distances, treated approaching P-51s as hostile targets requiring immediate engagement. December 13, 1943 provided a sobering example of the identification problem's severity. During a mission to Kiel, a Mustang pilot found himself under fire from the very bombers he was protecting. The B-17's top turret gunner, following standard procedures for engaging apparent Bf-109s, scored hits on the American fighter. The pilot's immediate concern about fuel loss highlighted another vulnerability. Unlike the rugged P-47 with its air-cooled radial engine and robust construction, the Mustang's liquid-cooled system made it vulnerable to even minor damage. These early combat experiences reinforced existing prejudices among fighter pilots transitioning from other aircraft types. Veterans who had developed emotional attachments to their P-47 Thunderbolts viewed the Mustang with particular suspicion. The Thunderbolt represented everything American about fighter design. Heavy, powerful, and devastating in a dive, equipped with 850 caliber machine guns that could literally saw enemy aircraft in half. The P-47's massive radial engine could absorb incredible punishment and continue running. Its thick wings and robust construction suggested invulnerability that the delicate-looking Mustang couldn't match. The transition process from P-47s to P-51s created additional resistance among experienced pilots. Men who had learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths found themselves forced to master entirely different combat techniques. The Mustang required finesse where the P-47 demanded brute force. Its lighter construction and different handling characteristics felt alien to pilots accustomed to wrestling with the Thunderbolt's massive controls. Many questioned whether trading proven capability for unproven promise made tactical sense. Range limitations added another layer of frustration for Escort pilots. Even with the Mustang's superior fuel capacity, early combat deployments revealed the agonizing reality of bomber protection duties. P-47 pilots had experienced this limitation repeatedly during 1943 operations. They would escort bomber formations to the limit of their fuel range, then watch helplessly as German fighters swarmed the unprotected bombers during the most dangerous portions of their missions. The sight of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s gathering like wolves beyond escort range created profound psychological stress among fighter pilots who understood their abandonment meant death for bomber crews. The institutional momentum behind competing programs further delayed serious P-51 development. General Motors had invested enormous resources in the P-75 Eagle project, promising military planners a purpose-built escort fighter that would eliminate the need for improvised solutions. The P-75's specifications looked impressive on paper: long range, heavy armament, high performance at altitude. Military procurement officers saw no reason to pursue alternative designs when America's largest corporation was developing the perfect solution. Reality proved more complex than corporate promises suggested. When test pilots finally evaluated the P-75 in combat conditions, they discovered catastrophic performance problems. The aircraft couldn't defend itself against enemy fighters, much less protect bomber formations. One evaluation report stated bluntly that the P-75 represented a complete failure of design philosophy. America's supposed superfighter couldn't compete with existing German aircraft, let alone provide the revolutionary capability that strategic bombing required. The P-75's failure should have triggered immediate reconsideration of the P-51 program. Instead, military bureaucracy created additional delays while procurement officers searched for face-saving alternatives. Months passed while bomber crews died for lack of escort protection that already existed in experimental form. The XP-51 continued accumulating minimal flight hours while its potential remained unexplored. Even the Royal Air Force's initial enthusiasm failed to convince American skeptics. British test pilots had recognized the Mustang's potential immediately, but their reports faced dismissal from American military leaders who questioned British judgment about fighter aircraft. The RAF's desperate situation in 1940 had forced them to accept any available aircraft, leading some Americans to believe that British enthusiasm reflected desperation rather than genuine capability assessment. The breakthrough that would transform everything was already taking shape across the Atlantic, though few Americans understood its significance. British engineers had begun experimenting with installing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and Mustang airframes, replacing the problematic Allison power plants that limited high-altitude performance. The results of these experiments would soon demonstrate that the aircraft American pilots had dismissed as mediocre was actually revolutionary. But that transformation remained months in the future, while German fighters continued decimating unescorted bomber formations, and American military planners struggled to understand what they had overlooked in their rush to dismiss the fighter that would ultimately win the air war over Europe. April 1942. Hucknall Aerodrome, England. Ronald Hawker gripped the control stick of the modified Mustang as the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine roared to life beneath the elongated nose. The two-stage supercharged power plant represented everything the original Allison installation was not: complex, sophisticated, and engineered specifically for high-altitude warfare. As the aircraft climbed through 20,000 feet, Hawker felt the transformation that would reshape aerial combat forever. Where the Allison-powered Mustang had gasped for breath in the thin air, this Merlin-equipped variant surged forward with undiminished power. The performance figures that emerged from British testing defied comprehension. The same airframe that American pilots had dismissed as adequate was now achieving 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than its predecessor. The marriage of North American's revolutionary laminar flow wing design with Rolls-Royce's superb engineering had created something unprecedented. A fighter that could match German performance at altitude while maintaining fuel capacity for extended operations. Yet even this dramatic breakthrough failed to generate immediate American interest. Military planners remained committed to existing programs, viewing the British modifications as interesting experiments rather than urgent necessities. The bureaucratic momentum that had delayed P-51 development for months continued grinding forward, indifferent to combat results that contradicted established assumptions. Meanwhile, American bomber crews were discovering the true cost of inadequate escort protection. The October 14, 1943 mission to Schweinfurt provided a horrifying demonstration of what happened when flying fortresses ventured beyond fighter range. Of 291 B-17s that departed English bases that morning, 60 failed to return. Another 138 sustained varying degrees of battle damage. The mathematics were unsustainable. At such loss rates, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. The 77% casualty rate among bomber crews between 1942 and 1944 reflected a strategic crisis that existing fighter aircraft couldn't solve. P-47 pilots watched helplessly as their fuel gauges approached empty while German fighters assembled for coordinated attacks. The Thunderbolt's limited range meant abandoning bomber formations during the most dangerous portions of their missions. Every escort pilot understood that their departure sentenced bomber crews to face concentrated enemy fighter attacks without protection. The psychological toll on both bomber and fighter crews reached breaking points by late 1943. B-17 crewmen calculated their survival odds during the endless hours over enemy territory. 25 missions to complete a tour. 1 chance in 4 of surviving. The mathematics of death became daily reality for young men who watched their friends disappear into German skies with systematic regularity. Fighter pilots experienced different but equally corrosive stress. Their mission required them to protect bombers, yet their aircraft lacked the range to fulfill that responsibility completely. The sight of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s gathering beyond escort range created profound moral conflicts. Pilots understood that their fuel limitations meant betraying the trust bomber crews placed in fighter protection. German fighter tactics exploited these limitations with devastating effectiveness. Luftwaffe commanders positioned their interceptors along known bomber routes, waiting for the moment when American escorts reached their fuel limits and turned for home. The period immediately following escort departure became known as the killing time, when German fighters could attack bomber formations without interference. The crisis reached such severity that deep penetration bombing operations faced suspension unless long-range escort capability could be developed. Strategic bombing doctrine depended entirely on the ability to strike targets throughout German-controlled territory. Without adequate fighter protection, bombers couldn't reach critical industrial centers that fed the German war machine. Into this desperate situation came the first production P-51Bs in late 1943, equipped with Packard-built versions of the Merlin engine. The aircraft that arrived at 8th Air Force bases looked identical to the mediocre fighters that pilots had dismissed months earlier. The same sleek fuselage, the same distinctive radiator scoop, the same European appearance that violated American fighter design principles. Only the sound of the engine suggested that something fundamental had changed. Initial pilot reactions remained skeptical. Veterans transitioning from P-47s questioned whether trading-proven capability for experimental technology made sense during active combat operations. The Mustang's lighter construction and different handling characteristics required significant adaptation from pilots accustomed to the Thunderbolt's massive authority. Many wondered whether the new aircraft's supposed advantages would translate into actual combat effectiveness. The deployment schedule forced extremely rapid transitions that would be considered dangerous by peacetime standards. Pilots received minimal checkout time in the new aircraft before conducting combat operations over enemy territory. Some took off for their first operational missions with less than an hour of P-51 experience. The urgent need for long-range escorts overrode normal training protocols. February 28, 1944 marked a turning point that few participants fully understood at the time. Fighter groups equipped with P-51s prepared for operations that would demonstrate the aircraft's revolutionary capabilities. The pilots climbing into their cockpits that morning carried the accumulated skepticism of months of delayed development and institutional resistance. They expected adequate performance from their new mounts, nothing more. What they discovered over the next several weeks would transform aerial warfare forever. The Mustang's combination of range, speed, and maneuverability created tactical possibilities that had never existed before. For the first time since strategic bombing operations began, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back to England. The killing time that German fighters had exploited for months was ending. The psychological impact on German pilots proved as significant as the tactical advantages. Luftwaffe veterans who had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers suddenly faced aggressive fighter opposition hundreds of miles inside German territory. The sight of American fighters over Berlin shattered German assumptions about Allied capabilities and marked the beginning of Luftwaffe decline. But the true test of the P-51's revolutionary potential was still approaching. The week of February 20th through 25th, 1944 would demonstrate what happened when adequate numbers of long-range fighters finally reached operational status. February 20th, 1944. The weather over Central Europe cleared for the first time in weeks, revealing skies that would witness the most decisive aerial combat of the war. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, began with nearly 1,000 Allied bombers streaming toward German aircraft manufacturing centers. But unlike previous maximum effort raids, these formations carried something unprecedented. Complete fighter escort from takeoff to landing, provided by squadrons of P-51 Mustangs that could finally reach any target the bombers could attack. The German response followed established patterns that had proven devastatingly effective throughout 1943. Luftwaffe controllers vectored experienced fighter units toward the approaching bomber streams, confident that Allied escorts would eventually reach fuel limits and abandon their charges. The tactical doctrine that had slaughtered unprotected flying fortresses for months required only patience. Wait for the escorts to depart, then strike with overwhelming force against defenseless bombers. What happened next shattered 3 years of successful German fighter tactics. As Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s positioned for their traditional attacks, the American escorts refused to leave. P-51s that should have been streaming back toward England instead maintained station with the bomber formations, their Merlin engines providing fuel efficiency that German intelligence had failed to recognize. For the first time in the European Air War, Luftwaffe fighters faced the terrifying prospect of engaging bombers protected by fighters throughout their entire mission. The tactical revolution extended beyond simple escort duration. Allied fighter commanders had received new orders that transformed the nature of aerial combat over Europe. Instead of maintaining rigid defensive formations around bombers, P-51 pilots gained permission to pursue and destroy German fighters wherever they found them. The change from defensive escort to offensive hunter missions unleashed capabilities that the Mustang's exceptional performance made devastatingly effective. Major James Howard's single-handed defense of an entire bomber formation on January 11th had provided a preview of what aggressive P-51 tactics could accomplish. Flying alone after his squadron became separated in cloud cover, Howard engaged multiple flights of German fighters attempting to attack the bombers under his protection. For 30 minutes, his solitary Mustang weaved through enemy formations, destroying confirmed kills while disrupting coordinated attacks that would have decimated unprotected bombers. The German pilots found themselves facing tactics they had never encountered. Never before had a single Allied fighter challenged the Luftwaffe so aggressively deep inside German territory. The psychological impact proved as significant as the tactical results. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to methodical bomber interceptions suddenly faced opponents who actively sought combat rather than avoiding it. Focke-Wulf pilots discovered that the sleek American fighters could match their performance in every flight regime while carrying fuel loads that permitted sustained combat operations hundreds of miles from Allied bases. During the first day of Big Week, P-51s accompanying bomber formations to Leipzig and Brunswick demonstrated the full extent of their capabilities. When German fighters attempted their traditional attacks, American escorts responded with coordinated counterattacks that turned hunter into hunted. Messerschmitt 109 pilots accustomed to selecting their engagement parameters found themselves forced into disadvantageous combat by opponents who could dictate the terms of aerial battles. The kill ratios that emerged from these engagements defied everything German commanders understood about aerial combat effectiveness. American pilots flying aircraft that had been dismissed as mediocre just months earlier were achieving victory margins that seemed impossible against experienced Luftwaffe veterans. The combination of superior performance, adequate numbers, and aggressive tactics created a tactical environment where German fighter units faced systematic destruction. February 22nd brought the most devastating day of aerial combat in Luftwaffe history. Over 900 Allied bombers attacked German aircraft factories, while nearly 700 escort fighters provided continuous protection. The scale of the operation overwhelmed German defensive responses that had been designed to counter smaller, unescorted formations. Luftwaffe units that attempted to amass for coordinated attacks found themselves engaged by P-51s before they could organize effective bomber interceptions. The German pilot losses during this single day represented catastrophic degradation of Luftwaffe combat effectiveness. Nearly 100 experienced fighter pilots died in combat, representing skills and knowledge that required years to develop and could never be replaced. The training pipeline that had produced Germany's elite fighter force had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, leaving no possibility of replacing these losses with equally qualified personnel. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's reaction to reports of American fighters over Berlin captured the strategic implications of P-51 deployment. When Mustangs appeared in the skies above the German capital, escorting bombers on missions that had previously been impossible, Göring reportedly declared that he knew the war was lost. The sight of enemy fighters operating freely over the Reich's political center demonstrated Allied air superiority that German forces could no longer contest effectively. The cumulative effect of Big Week extended far beyond immediate aircraft and pilot losses. German aircraft manufacturing, already struggling under sustained bombing pressure, faced additional disruption as skilled workers fled factories under constant air attack. The integrated production system that supported Luftwaffe operations began fragmenting under pressure that ground-based defenses could no longer reduce. More significantly, the psychological dominance that German fighter pilots had maintained over Allied air crews since the beginning of the war finally shattered. American bomber crews who had endured months of inadequate escort protection discovered that their new fighter escorts possessed both the capability and aggressiveness to defeat German interceptors consistently. The morale transformation among bomber crews proved as tactically significant as the improved survival rates. P-51 pilots themselves underwent parallel psychological transformation as combat experience validated their aircraft's exceptional capabilities. Veterans who had initially resisted transitioning from P-47s discovered that the Mustang's performance advantages translated into tactical superiority that more than compensated for its initially unfamiliar handling characteristics. The aircraft that had seemed delicate compared to the massive Thunderbolt proved capable of absorbing battle damage while maintaining combat effectiveness. The friendly fire problems that had plagued early P-51 deployments began diminishing as bomber crews gained experience identifying their escorts. Gunners who had initially engaged any aircraft resembling German fighters learned to recognize the Mustang's distinctive silhouette and flight characteristics. The reduction in fratricide incidents improved tactical coordination, while reducing the stress that had affected both bomber and fighter crews during early operations. By the end of February 1944, statistical analysis revealed the magnitude of transformation that P-51 deployment had created. Bomber loss rates that had reached unsustainable levels during unescorted operations fell dramatically once continuous fighter protection became available. The reduction from 9.1% in February 1944 represented thousands% losses in October 1943 to 3.5% of lives saved and billions of dollars in equipment preserved. The German fighter force that had dominated European skies since 1940 found itself facing systematic destruction at rates that made continued resistance impossible. Luftwaffe units that had previously enjoyed tactical advantages over Allied forces discovered that American fighters now possessed superior performance, adequate numbers, and tactical doctrines specifically designed to exploit German weaknesses. March 1944 brought expanded P-51 operations that demonstrated the full strategic implications of long-range fighter deployment. Bomber formations escorted by Mustangs could strike any target within German territory while maintaining protection that made interception attempts extremely costly for defending fighters. The tactical situation that had favored German defenders throughout 1943 reversed completely once adequate escort capability became available. The transformation extended beyond immediate combat results to influence strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Allied commanders who had previously accepted bomber losses as an inevitable cost of strategic bombing operations discovered that proper fighter escort could reduce casualties to sustainable levels while maintaining operational effectiveness. The mathematical equation that governed strategic bombing had fundamentally changed in favor of Allied operations. German defensive responses revealed the depth of crisis facing Luftwaffe operations. Fighter units that attempted to concentrate against specific bomber formations found themselves engaged by escort fighters that possessed performance advantages in every significant combat parameter. The tactical flexibility that had allowed German commanders to achieve local superiority through concentration of forces no longer functioned against escorts that could match German performance while maintaining numerical advantages. The institutional resistance that had delayed P-51 development for crucial months finally collapsed under the weight of combat results that vindicated every performance claim made by the aircraft's advocates. Military leaders who had dismissed the Mustang as an unnecessary distraction from established programs found themselves authorizing maximum production rates to meet desperate operational requirements. The aircraft that pilots had laughed at was systematically destroying the most experienced fighter force in aviation history. The Luftwaffe's decline would accelerate through spring 1944 as P-51 operations expanded to cover all major bombing missions. What had begun as institutional skepticism toward an untested design would culminate in complete Allied air superiority achieved through the revolutionary capabilities of the fighter that military experts had almost overlooked entirely. The numbers emerging from March 1944 operations told a story that German high command refused to acknowledge publicly but could no longer ignore in private strategic assessments. Luftwaffe fighter strength that had peaked at over 2,400 operational aircraft in late 1943 was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at rates that made unit replacement impossible. Each engagement with P-51 equipped formations resulted in kill ratios that favored American forces by margins previously unthinkable in aerial warfare. German fighter pilots who had entered combat with hundreds of hours of training found themselves outmatched by opponents flying superior aircraft with tactical advantages that eliminated traditional German strengths. The cascade effect of pilot losses created organizational collapse throughout the Luftwaffe. Squadron commanders with years of combat experience died in engagements that lasted minutes. Flight leaders who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Russian front discovered that their accumulated tactical knowledge meant nothing against opponents who could dictate engagement parameters through superior aircraft performance. The institutional memory that had made German fighter units the world's most effective air force was being systematically destroyed by American pilots flying aircraft that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. Training replacement pilots to fill the expanding gaps in German fighter strength required resources that no longer existed. The elaborate flight training programs that had produced Germany's elite fighter pilots had been eliminated by fuel shortages and Allied bombing of training facilities. New pilots reaching operational units possessed perhaps 60 hours of flight time compared to the 250 hours that had been standard earlier in the war. These inexperienced aviators faced American opponents who arrived in theater with over 400 hours of training, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical instruction. The qualitative superiority of American pilot training became apparent during combat engagements, where individual skill differences determined survival. P-51 pilots had practiced deflection shooting against towed targets, studied gun camera footage from actual combat, and received instruction in advanced tactical formations. German replacement pilots often flew their first combat missions with minimal gunnery training and no experience in coordinated fighter operations. The outcome of such mismatches was predetermined by preparation disparities that reflected broader resource advantages. Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson's combat record during this period exemplified the systematic destruction of German air power that P-51 operations achieved. On May 27, 1944, Anderson's flight of 4 Mustangs encountered 4 Messerschmitt 109Gs attacking from above at 30,000 feet. The engagement that followed demonstrated every advantage that the P-51 possessed over its German opponents. Anderson's formation broke the German attack through superior maneuverability, aircraft engaged. The tactical sophistication that Anderson then used their aircraft's performance characteristics to achieve firing positions that resulted in 3 confirmed kills from 4 enemies' engagement revealed reflected training and aircraft capabilities that German forces could no longer match. American pilots understood how to exploit the Mustang's strengths while avoiding situations that might favor enemy aircraft. They had learned to use their superior range to select engagement parameters, their better high-altitude performance to maintain tactical advantages, and their aircraft's excellent handling characteristics to outmaneuver opponents in sustained combat. German tactical responses to a P-51 deployment revealed the depth of crisis facing Luftwaffe operations. Fighter units that had previously relied on altitude advantage and coordinated attacks found themselves unable to achieve either against escorts that could match their climb performance while maintaining station with bomber formations. The bounce tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against earlier Allied fighters failed against opponents who could turn disadvantageous situations into offensive opportunities through superior aircraft performance. The psychological transformation among German fighter pilots became as significant as their tactical defeats. Veterans who had dominated European skies since 1940 discovered that American fighters could challenge them successfully in any flight regime. The confidence that had sustained German air superiority through years of combat eroded under repeated encounters with opponents who possessed both superior equipment and training advantages that eliminated traditional German strengths. April 1944 brought expanded P-51 operations that demonstrated the full extent of Allied air superiority over German territory. Bomber formations escorted by Mustangs penetrated German airspace with impunity, while fighter sweeps cleared defending aircraft from areas that had previously been considered German strongholds. The tactical situation that had favored defenders throughout the early war period reversed completely as American forces gained the ability to project air power throughout occupied Europe. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate combat results to influence German defensive planning for the anticipated invasion of Western Europe. Luftwaffe commanders recognized that their remaining fighter strength could not contest Allied air operations effectively, forcing German ground forces to plan defensive operations without meaningful air support. The air superiority that German forces had enjoyed during their successful campaigns in Poland, France, and early Russia now belonged entirely to their enemies. Production statistics revealed the industrial foundation that supported American air superiority. North American aviation's factories were producing Mustangs at rates that exceeded German aircraft manufacturing, despite sustained Allied bombing of German production facilities. The 8,032 P-51D variants that would eventually be manufactured represented more aircraft than Germany produced in any single fighter type during the entire war. American industrial capacity had created numerical advantages that German forces could not overcome through tactical superiority or individual pilot skill. The versatility that P-51 deployment provided Allied operations transformed strategic bombing from a costly gamble into a sustainable campaign that systematically dismantled German war production. Bomber formations that had previously faced unsustainable loss rates during unescorted missions discovered that proper fighter protection reduced casualties to levels that permitted continued operations. The mathematical equation governing strategic bombing had shifted decisively in favor of Allied forces through the revolutionary capabilities of escort fighters that could match any German interceptor. May 1944 witnessed the culmination of P-51 impact on European aerial warfare. German fighter resistance to Allied bombing operations collapsed as remaining Luftwaffe units proved incapable of inflicting significant losses on properly escorted formations. The air superiority gave way to systematic destruction of German defensive battles that had characterized the struggle for air capabilities by forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in equipment, training, and numbers. The aircraft that American military leaders had dismissed as unnecessary competition for established programs had achieved what no other fighter could accomplish. Strategic bombing operations that had faced suspension due to unsustainable losses became routine missions that German forces could not contest effectively. The institutional resistance that had delayed P-51 development for crucial months had nearly cost Allied forces the war's most decisive weapon. German acknowledgement of P-51 superiority came through actions rather than official statements. Luftwaffe units that had previously sought combat with Allied formations began avoiding engagements that inevitably resulted in German losses. Fighter pilots who had once aggressively intercepted unescorted bombers discovered that attacking properly escorted formations meant facing opponents whose performance advantages made survival unlikely. The transformation of aerial warfare over Europe was complete by June 1944. German air power that had dominated continental skies for 4 years faced systematic elimination by American forces equipped with aircraft that German designers had never anticipated. The P-51 Mustang had evolved from an object of institutional skepticism into the weapon that achieved Allied air superiority and made victory in Europe inevitable. The laughter had stopped. The reckoning had begun. The story of the P-51 Mustang stands as testament to a profound truth about innovation and institutional resistance. The aircraft that gathered dust on Wright Field's tarmac for months became the weapon that shattered German air supremacy forever. Military experts who had dismissed it as unnecessary found themselves witnessing the systematic destruction of the world's most experienced fighter force by pilots flying the very machine they had overlooked. From institutional skepticism to revolutionary vindication, the Mustang's journey reveals how breakthrough capabilities often emerge from sources that conventional wisdom rejects. The fighter that pilots initially laughed at achieved what established programs promised, but failed to deliver. Complete air superiority over Europe through the marriage of exceptional design, superior performance, and industrial capacity that overwhelmed every German response. The Luftwaffe's destruction was complete by war's end. Their laughter had become silence. The P-51 had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from following established doctrine, but from recognizing revolutionary potential that others cannot see.